The town was small, the kind of place where every corner store clerk knew your name, and life moved at a pace too slow for most outsiders to notice. Rows of modest houses sat quietly under the Midwest sky, each with trimmed lawns and porches that creaked when families gathered on summer evenings. It was a place where nothing spectacular ever happened, and that was exactly how the people liked it. In the middle of it all lived a girl named Claire. To her teachers, she was quiet, attentive, and polite. She never disrupted the class, never sought the spotlight, and rarely raised her hand unless directly called upon. Her grades were solid, though not dazzling, and her presence in school was often described in one word: ordinary. Claire's classmates barely noticed her. She wasn't the kind to wear the latest fashion or join the loudest cliques. She walked through the halls like a ghost, often lost in thought, her gaze lingering on small details others missed. A poster peeling slightly from the wall, the way light shifted through cracked blinds, or the exact rhythm of footsteps echoing in the gym. It wasn't that she wanted to be invisible. She simply was. Her parents worked long hours. Her father managed a hardware store on the edge of town, and her mother balanced shifts at the diner. They loved her, of course, but their attention was often consumed by bills, long shifts, and keeping food on the table. Claire never complained. She spent her evenings reading, sketching, or wandering the woods near her house, where silence seemed to breathe life into her thoughts. It was in those woods where her eyes sharpened. While other kids her age scrolled endlessly through phones, Claire studied the flight of birds, the way leaves quivered with the slightest wind, or the twitch of a rabbit's ear when danger approached. She noticed everything. The woods were her quiet sanctuary, but they were also her classroom. One she didn't realize was preparing her for something far beyond her imagination. Despite her sharp eyes and calm presence, to the town, Claire was nothing more than a quiet girl. She worked weekends at the local library, stacking books in silence, occasionally offering a small smile when thanked. People described her as sweet or shy, never remarkable, never extraordinary. The most attention she ever received came from teachers who gently encouraged her to speak up more, or neighbors who asked her to babysit their children. But beneath that still surface, something unusual stirred. Claire's grandfather lived on the far edge of town, in a creaky old farmhouse that smelled of tobacco, oil, and worn leather. Most neighbors thought of him as a recluse, an old veteran who had fought in a war he never spoke about. His yard was overgrown, his porch stacked with tools, and his windows always half-shuttered. Children whispered rumors that he was grumpy, maybe even dangerous. But to Claire, he was neither. To her, he was the only person who seemed to see her clearly. When she visited him, she felt the weight of silence, but not the uncomfortable kind. His home carried a stillness that sharpened the senses. Every tick of the clock seemed louder there, every creak of the floor intentional, every sound magnified. Her grandfather didn't waste words. He spoke with precision, as if each sentence had been measured before being released. It was he who noticed her gift before anyone else. One autumn afternoon, when she was about 10 years old, she sat on his porch watching a hawk circle above the tree line. "Most people wouldn't even notice that bird," he said suddenly, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. She looked at him, startled. He nodded toward the sky. "Not just see it. Notice it. The angle, the height, the way the wind carries it. You watch like a hunter." Claire frowned. "I'm not a hunter." "No," he said, his eyes narrowing with something between approval and concern. "But you see like one." From that moment, something began to shift. He started teaching her small lessons, never calling them training, but that's what they were. At first, it was simple things. How to sit still in the woods without disturbing the world around her. How to breathe so quietly she could listen to the forest. How to notice patterns others ignored. When he handed her a BB gun, She hesitated. He guided her hand, not with force, but with patience. "Steady," he whispered. "It's not about pulling the trigger. It's about becoming still enough that the world aligns with you." The first time she hit a tin can from 20 yards away, she laughed. He didn't. He only nodded, his face unreadable. Once his luck, twice his practice, 100 times his skill. Over the years, the lessons deepened. He showed her how to account for distance, how wind could shift a shot by inches, how timing could matter more than strength. He taught her how to trust her instincts, how to breathe through fear, and most importantly, how to remain calm when everything else was chaos. But outside those moments with her grandfather, Claire remained the same quiet, ordinary girl. No one at school suspected she spent her weekends in the woods, learning the discipline of focus and patience. No one knew she could outshoot most hunters in the county. Her grandfather warned her never to boast, never to reveal. "Skill is a shadow," he told her. "It only matters when the light finds it." By the time she turned 17, she could hit moving targets with uncanny precision. She could steady her hands through storms, align her shots with the rhythm of her heartbeat, and measure distance without tools. Her grandfather watched her with quiet pride, but never smiled openly. His eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen what such skill could mean in war, in life, in death. To the town, however, Claire was still invisible. She worked quietly, studied quietly, lived quietly. Her classmates graduated with dreams of leaving, chasing colleges, careers, and adventures. Claire, it seemed, would stay behind, working small jobs and living in silence. But deep within her, something lingered. A sense that all those years of stillness, all those lessons hidden in the woods, had been preparing her for something greater. She didn't know when, she didn't know how, but she knew. Her life, for now, looked perfectly ordinary. But in truth, it was anything but. And one day soon, the world would find out. Her grandfather's name was Thomas Callahan, though most people in town only knew him as the old vet who lived on the edge of the woods. To the neighbors, he was a relic of another time, stoic, solitary, and scarred by memories he never shared. They saw the limp in his step, the lines etched deep into his face, and the way he avoided crowded places. To them, he was just another veteran who preferred silence to conversation. But Claire knew better. Thomas carried a history that weighed heavier than the rifles he had once shouldered. He had been a sniper in Vietnam, a man whose job depended on patience, precision, and the ability to do the unthinkable without hesitation. He never boasted, never told war stories at the bar, and never hung medals on his wall. His service was written not in photographs or trophies, but in the haunted stillness of his eyes. For years, he had tried to bury that part of his life. But when he looked at Claire, something stirred, recognition. She was like him in ways that unsettled him. The quietness, the sharpness, the way she absorbed her surroundings with unnatural focus. She reminded him of himself at her age, long before the war, long before the weight of his choices hardened him. It began innocently enough. When Claire was 10, he gave her a slingshot and challenged her to hit tin cans balanced on a fence. He expected her to miss, to grow frustrated, maybe even toss the slingshot aside. Instead, she studied the cans, studied the angle, studied the tension of the rubber, and hit her mark on the first try. She didn't cheer, didn't boast. She simply adjusted her grip, loaded another stone, and hit the second can. Thomas watched in silence. His hands tightened around the arms of his chair. He had seen that kind of focus before, in boot camp, in training fields, in the faces of men who would become sharpshooters. It wasn't luck. It was instinct. The following week, he brought her into the woods. At first, it was about hunting rabbits, tracking deer, learning the quiet rhythm of the forest. But he wasn't teaching her to hunt for food. He was teaching her to notice. The world speaks, he told her. The problem is most people are too loud to hear it. Claire listened. She learned to move without snapping twigs, to breathe in rhythm with the wind, to wait for hours without fidgeting. She studied animal tracks, shadows, and the shifting colors of the sky. Her grandfather's lessons were subtle, sometimes frustratingly so, but she absorbed them with a patience that surprised even him. When she turned 12, he handed her a rifle. Not a toy, not a BB gun, but a real rifle he had kept locked away for decades. She froze when he presented it, her hands trembling as she reached out. "I can't," she whispered. "You can," he replied. His voice was steady, not unkind, but firm. "And you will. Not because I want you to shoot, but because I need you to understand what it means to hold something like this." The rifle was heavy, far heavier than she expected. He showed her how to balance it, how to press the stock against her shoulder, how to line up the sights. He didn't let her fire right away. Instead, he had her stand still, holding the weapon until her arms ached, teaching her that endurance was as important as accuracy. When she finally took her first shot, the recoil startled her, but she didn't drop the weapon. The bullet struck a tree stump, a clean miss. Thomas said nothing. He simply reset the target and gestured for her to try again. By the end of the day, her shoulder was bruised, but her shots grew closer. The following week, she hit her first bullseye. From that day forward, the lessons deepened. Thomas taught her to steady her breathing, to align her heartbeat with the moment she squeezed the trigger. He taught her to account for distance, to calculate wind drift, to measure in seconds what most people couldn't solve in minutes. He told her that a sniper's greatest weapon wasn't the rifle, but the ability to wait, to become invisible, to blend into the silence until the right moment arrived. "You don't win by pulling the trigger," he said one evening as the sun bled across the horizon. "You win by waiting, by letting the world reveal its weakness before you reveal your strength." Claire absorbed every word. But it wasn't just technique he passed down. He told her about discipline, about responsibility. He warned her that every shot carried weight, that skill meant nothing without restraint. "The best snipers," he said, "aren't the ones who take the most shots. They're the ones who take the fewest." Claire carried those words like scripture. By the time she was 16, she could outshoot hunters twice her age. She could hit moving targets from impossible distances, track sound through heavy rain, and remain perfectly still for hours without twitching. Her grandfather, though proud, remained guarded. He knew the world wasn't ready for someone like her. He also knew what such skill could demand of a person, and he wasn't sure if he had cursed her by passing it down. In private, he sometimes wrestled with guilt. Had he trained her because he wanted to prepare her, or because he couldn't let go of the war that still haunted him? He had sworn never to drag his family into the shadows of his past. Yet here was Claire, walking that same path with frightening ease. But when he watched her, steady, patient, precise, he also saw hope. Perhaps she could use what he had taught her not as a weapon of war, but as a tool of protection. Perhaps her story wouldn't mirror his. To Claire, he wasn't a strict mentor or a hardened veteran. He was simply her grandfather, the only person who saw her for who she truly was. While her parents and classmates overlooked her, he recognized her sharpness, her quiet intensity, and he nurtured it. Their bond was built on silence and discipline, but beneath it was love, a love too deep for many words. Still, he reminded her often, "Don't show this to the world. Not yet. They wouldn't understand. Skill is a shadow, Claire. It only matters when the light finds it." She nodded every time, believing him. To everyone else, she remained invisible. But under his guidance, she was becoming something the world had never seen. And though she didn't know it then, the day would come when his words would echo in her mind, and one shot would prove him right. By the time Claire reached her late teens, the lessons her grandfather had planted in her childhood had taken root so deeply that they became second nature. What began as hesitant steps in the woods, clumsy hands holding a rifle, had transformed into something remarkable. She no longer needed constant guidance. Her instincts sharpened with each passing season, until Thomas himself admitted, quietly and only once, that she had surpassed him. Her gift was not just in her accuracy, but in her entire presence. She carried herself with an unusual calmness, even in situations that made others restless. If a storm shook the town, children shrieking as lightning split the sky, Claire would stand at the window, her eyes steady on the shifting branches. Where others panicked, she calculated. Where others froze, she observed. She didn't just see the world, she read it. One autumn afternoon, her grandfather tested her in a way he never had before. He set up a moving target, a bottle suspended by a rope, swaying with the wind. She studied it for a long time, waiting, breathing. Then, with one controlled exhale, she fired. The bullet cut clean through the glass, shattering it mid-swing. She didn't flinch. She didn't cheer. She simply lowered the rifle and reloaded. Her grandfather chuckled, a rare sound. "You're no longer just learning," he said. "You've become." But she didn't see it that way. To Claire, it was simply practice, repetition, discipline. She never thought of herself as extraordinary. She never bragged or sought validation. In fact, she often kept her achievements to herself, even when her grandfather encouraged her to feel proud. Her modesty, her quiet nature, kept her gift hidden in the shadows. At school, no one had any idea who she was becoming. To her classmates, she was still the quiet girl in the back row, doodling in her notebook or staring out the window. They teased her sometimes for being boring or weird, but Claire never reacted. She had no interest in defending herself. If they thought she was dull, let them. Their opinions were noise, and she had been trained all her life to hear past the noise. What they didn't know was that on weekends, when they were scrolling through social media or hanging out at the mall, Claire was lying in the forest, her body pressed to the dirt, steadying her breathing against the rhythm of her pulse. She was measuring distance with her eyes, calculating angles, learning how the environment itself could be both an ally and an enemy. She was building herself into something that no one around her could comprehend. Her grandfather's lessons grew harsher as she grew stronger. He challenged her endurance, making her hold her aim for long minutes until her arms burned. He made her wait in biting cold for hours before allowing her to take a single shot. "Patience," he said. "This is where most fail. They break under time, not distance." She didn't break. At 17, she achieved something her grandfather had never been able to do consistently. She struck 5 moving targets in a row at long range. Each one hit in the precise center. When she turned to him, expecting criticism, he only stared at her with a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. "You've gone further than I ever did," he said softly. "And that frightens me? Why?" she asked. "Because the world doesn't forgive people like us," he replied. Claire didn't fully understand then. To her, the rifle was a discipline, a skill like painting or playing an instrument. She didn't see it as a curse. But in Thomas's mind, he had seen how governments, wars, and chaos devoured men with skills like his. He had lived through the consequences of being too precise, too steady, too deadly. His fear wasn't of her ability. It was of what the world might demand from her one day. Still, he continued to train her, because he knew that skill, once discovered, could not be undone. Better she control it, better she discipline it, and let it twist into recklessness. By 18, her accuracy was legendary, though only in secret. She could split a playing card in half at 50 yards. She could hit a target so far away that most people couldn't even see it clearly. She had trained herself to shoot between heartbeats, lowering her pulse to steady her aim. Her grandfather, who once thought himself unmatched, admitted privately that Claire's patience exceeded his own. But the world remained oblivious. Claire worked part-time jobs, stacked shelves at the grocery store, smiled politely at customers, and went home unnoticed. Her coworkers described her as sweet but quiet. They had no idea that after her shift, she walked into the woods and became someone else entirely. She began keeping notebooks filled with calculations, wind speed, bullet trajectory, sight adjustments. She didn't show them to anyone, not even her grandfather. They were her private scripture, pages of equations and sketches that made sense only to her. When she flipped through them, she felt a strange comfort, as if the numbers anchored her to something greater than herself. Yet, despite her growing mastery, she never once thought of using her gift outside of practice. She had no interest in hunting for trophies or showing off to friends. Her skill remained locked away in silence, just like her grandfather had taught her. And so, the town continued to overlook her. At graduation, while her peers celebrated their futures, colleges, travel plans, careers, Claire stood quietly in her cap and gown, clapping politely as names were called. No one knew that the quiet girl in the back row was capable of feats most professional snipers would envy. No one knew she carried a discipline honed in shadows, built from years of patience and pain. But her grandfather knew, and in his knowing, he carried a burden. He saw the way her story was shaping itself, the inevitability of her path. For years he told her the same words, over and over. Stay hidden. Don't show them yet. The time will come when you'll have no choice, and when it does, everything will change. She nodded every time, but she didn't truly believe him. To her, the idea of the world ever discovering her skill felt impossible. Who would ever notice the quiet girl who worked at the library, who walked home alone, who never raised her voice? And yet, deep down, she felt it too. That sense of inevitability. That one day, the silence would break. For now, though, she kept her gift in the shadows. But shadows can't hide forever. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday. The air was warm, the streets buzzing with the sound of children riding bicycles, shop doors jingling open, and neighbors chatting on porches. The town square was crowded with families enjoying a weekend. Festival, food trucks, music, and laughter filling the air. For Claire, it was just another afternoon of blending into the background, moving quietly through the crowd with a book tucked under her arm, unnoticed as always. But then the sound of joy was shattered by something far darker. At first, it was confusion, a sharp crack that didn't belong in the rhythm of the day. Some thought it was fireworks. Children clapped, pointing at the sky. But Claire froze. Her ears caught the distinct echo that no firework could mimic. A gunshot. Her body stiffened before her mind even processed it. Instinct trained into her through years of silence with her grandfather. Screams erupted as people scattered. More cracks followed, sharp and deliberate, not random bursts. Claire's heart hammered, but not in panic. She felt herself slipping into the familiar stillness her grandfather had drilled into her. While chaos consumed the crowd, she became sharper, calmer. From the edge of the square, a man had taken position inside an abandoned office building overlooking the festival. He carried a rifle, his face shadowed by a cap. Through shattered windows, he fired into the open, pinning police officers behind barricades. The festive scene dissolved into terror as parents clutched children and shopkeepers dragged people into doorways for cover. The police scrambled, but they were trapped. Every time an officer tried to move, the man's rifle barked, forcing them back. From her vantage point near the edge of the square, Claire saw it clearly. He had height, cover, and control. To dislodge him would take a sniper, but their town had none. Her breath caught. For years, her grandfather's warnings had echoed in her mind. One day, the light will find you. She had never believed it. Until now. She pressed herself against a wall, her mind racing. She wasn't law enforcement. She wasn't trained for combat zones. But she also knew the police couldn't reach him in time. The longer he stayed in position, the higher the body count would climb. And with each passing second, the festival's panic grew, the crowd becoming more vulnerable. Her instincts screamed at her, "You can stop this." Her rational mind fought back. "This isn't your responsibility. You'll expose everything. You could be arrested. You could be killed." But as she watched a mother shield her children, trembling with fear, something shifted. She remembered her grandfather's words on responsibility, on restraint, on the weight of a single shot. He hadn't trained her for sport. He hadn't trained her for ego. He had trained her for a moment like this, even if neither of them had said it aloud. The choice pressed down on her like a weight. Stay invisible, let others handle it, and maybe live with the guilt of inaction forever. Or step forward, risk everything, and reveal the truth of who she was. Her hands shook. Her breathing faltered. But then, almost automatically, she found herself moving. Not away from the chaos, but toward it. Claire ducked into a side street, her mind snapping into calculation. She knew the building. She knew its angles, its lines of sight, its vulnerabilities. Her grandfather had taught her to assess terrain like a chessboard, and now every alley, every rooftop, every line of cover became part of her map. She had no rifle, at least not with her. But she remembered the small duffel she had left in her car parked blocks away. Inside was her grandfather's old rifle, one she had been practicing with only days earlier. She had brought it, intending to clean it later. Now, it was no longer just a relic. It was the only tool that could change everything. As the police shouted orders and sirens wailed, Claire slipped away from the panicked crowd and sprinted toward her car. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to breathe, to stay calm. Fear would only ruin her focus. When she reached the car, she flung open the trunk and unzipped the duffel. The rifle gleamed under the weak sunlight, cold and heavy in her hands. She loaded it with trembling fingers, then steadied herself. She remembered her grandfather's voice. Slow, always slow. Fear makes people rush. Patience saves lives. She moved back through the alleys, climbing a fire escape onto a neighboring rooftop. From there, she crouched low, crawling to the ledge. The city looked different from above. The chaos below reduced to patterns, fleeing civilians, pinned officers, the lone rifleman framed in a shattered window. Her breath slowed. Her hands steadied. The noise of sirens, screams, and chaos faded until there was only her and the target. For the first time, she wasn't practicing on cans or paper targets. For the first time, her aim carried the weight of life and death. She set the stock against her shoulder. Her heartbeat slowed, syncing with her breath. She aligned the sights, her finger resting gently against the trigger. She remembered every lesson, every whisper of patience her grandfather had given her. She could end it with one shot. And yet, doubt clawed at her. Could she do it? Could she cross the line from training to reality? She thought of the faces in the crowd, the mother clutching her children, the officers risking their lives, the festival turned battlefield. The answer came, not from logic, but from instinct. Yes, her breathing slowed to nothing. Time seemed to stretch. The world narrowed to a single heartbeat, a single trigger squeeze, a single decision. Her finger pressed. The shot rang out. The man crumpled instantly, his rifle slipping from his hands. Silence swept across the square, a heavy pause as if the entire town inhaled at once. Then came the cries. Shock, relief, disbelief. The gunman was down. The threat was over. But in that silence, Claire's life had changed forever. She lowered the rifle, her hands steady now, though her chest trembled with the aftershock. She knew there was no going back. She had revealed herself. And though no one yet knew it was her, the first threads of her secret had unraveled. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind, chilling and certain. Skill is a shadow. It only matters when the light finds it. The light had found her, and nothing would ever be the same again. The shot was fired. The man fell. For a heartbeat, silence swallowed the square. It was the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from shock, a void carved into chaos. Then, all at once, the sounds rushed back. The cries of families reunited, the gasps of onlookers, the shouts of officers storming the building where the gunman had fallen. From her rooftop perch, Claire lowered the rifle. Her hands didn't tremble, but her chest tightened with something she couldn't name. Relief? Fear? Both pressed against her ribs until she felt she could barely breathe. She had done it. She had ended the threat. She had saved lives. But she had also crossed a line she could never uncross. Her grandfather had always told her that every shot carried weight, that once a bullet left the barrel, there was no calling it back. For years, she had practiced with that truth hovering above her, but practice was safe. Targets didn't bleed. Cans didn't collapse. Numbers in a notebook didn't haunt the night. Now, though, the truth was real. She had ended a man's life. Even if he had been a threat, even if he had forced her hand, she could never erase that knowledge. Her hands felt heavier with the rifle than ever before. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to climb down the fire escape, to stash the weapon back in her car, to blend into the panicked crowd and vanish into anonymity. If she moved quickly, she could be just another face in the sea of confusion. No one would know it had been her. But her body wouldn't move. She crouched on the rooftop, frozen between action and paralysis, her eyes scanning the chaos below. Police were already pointing upward, trying to find the source of the shot. Radios crackled. Commands were shouted. They didn't know who had fired. Not yet, but they would. And when they did, her life would be dragged into the open. She closed her eyes, gripping the stock of the rifle tighter. Her grandfather's voice returned to her, as clear as if he were standing behind her. Skill is a shadow. It only matters when the light finds it. But the light is cruel, Claire. Once it sees you, it never lets go. And here it was, the light. She thought of her childhood, of all the years she had spent unnoticed, living quietly, blending into the background. That life had been safe, uneventful, small. And maybe that had been enough. But today proved it wasn't all she was meant for. Her gift wasn't just a curiosity. It was a responsibility. She opened her eyes again, forcing herself to watch the crowd. Parents held their children. Officers ushered civilians to safety. Strangers clung to one another in gratitude. People lived because of her. And yet, no one knew. She could keep it that way. She could vanish back into the shadows, bury her gift once more, and let the world believe the shot had been fired by some hidden officer or stroke of luck. The thought tempted her. It was the safer choice, the easier choice. But then she saw something that broke the illusion of safety. Near the barricades, a young boy sat crying, clutching a police officer's arm. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "She saved us," he cried, pointing toward the rooftops. His voice carried, clear even in the chaos. "Someone up there saved us." The crowd followed his gaze. Heads turned. Fingers pointed. Voices rose. The search had begun. Her heart sank. It was too late to hide. She pressed her back against the rooftop ledge, her mind spiraling. If she revealed herself, what would they say? Would they see her as a hero or as a criminal? Would they thank her, or would they punish her for stepping into a role that wasn't hers to claim? She wasn't police. She wasn't military. She wasn't anyone of authority. She was just Claire. Ordinary, invisible Claire. But invisible no longer. A sudden memory surfaced. A cold winter evening in the woods. She had been 15, shivering under layers of clothing, holding her rifle as frost bit her fingers. Her grandfather had made her wait hours before allowing her to take a shot at a target barely visible in the snow. She had grown angry, tired, ready to give up. Why do I have to sit here freezing? She had snapped. Because, Thomas had said, his eyes locked on hers, the moment will never wait for you. You have to decide if you're willing to suffer for it. If you're willing to own it. If not, then you're nothing but a hobbyist. A true sniper, Claire, chooses to bear the weight. Every time. The memory struck her now like a second bullet. She could leave and hide forever, but the weight of her choice would crush her. Or she could step into the light and bear it, no matter how cruel it might be. Her decision crystallized in the simplest truth. She hadn't trained all these years to stay invisible. Her grandfather hadn't passed his lessons to her, so she could live and die in silence. The world might not forgive her, but she had saved it once today. She could save it again. She rose slowly from her crouch, the rifle cradled against her chest. The crowd below pointed. Police officers shouted, motioning for her to show her hands, their weapons raised. Fear prickled at her skin, but she didn't flinch. She stepped into the open, letting the light find her fully for the first time. The world tilted in that moment. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't ordinary anymore. She had made her choice. The rooftop was no longer her refuge. It was a stage, and she was standing in the spotlight. Claire tightened her grip on the rifle, every muscle in her body alive with tension. Below, the police spread out like a net, weapons raised, voices echoing through bullhorns. Drop the weapon. Hands where we can see them. She froze at the ledge, torn between instinct and logic. She wasn't their enemy. Hadn't she just saved them? But to them, she looked like a threat. A lone figure with a rifle, silhouetted against the sky. They couldn't see the truth. They only saw the danger. For a second, her old self screamed inside her. Put it down, walk away, disappear again. But her new self, the one forged in fire and silence, the one her grandfather had prepared, stood taller. She wasn't here to be invisible anymore. Her chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately. She set the rifle down at her feet and raised her hands. But even then, she could feel the weight of eyes. Not just the police, but the crowd. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, staring up, whispering, pointing. The story of the one shot was already spreading like wildfire. A commanding officer stepped forward, his weapon still leveled on her. "Who are you?" He barked through the megaphone. Claire hesitated. Her mind raced. Should she give them her name? Should she stay silent? Every answer seemed both dangerous and meaningless. She had never wanted fame, never wanted recognition. Yet here she was, with all of it forced upon her. Before she could decide, a second crack echoed through the square. Not hers, not from her rifle. The crowd screamed again. Officers ducked for cover. Claire's eyes snapped to the source. Another shooter. He had been waiting, hidden in the chaos, perhaps an accomplice of the first man. From a window in a building opposite hers, the glint of another scope flashed. The nightmare wasn't over. Her pulse spiked, but training steadied her. She dropped to one knee, snatching up her rifle again. The officers shouted at her, thinking she was turning hostile, but she didn't have time to explain. If she hesitated, people would die. Through the scope, she found him, a shadowy figure crouched behind a broken frame, his weapon aimed straight at the square. He had a clear line on the officers, pinned in the open. Seconds, maybe less, before he squeezed the trigger. Her grandfather's lessons came flooding back. You'll only ever get one shot that matters. The world won't give you second chances. Make the first one count. She slowed her breathing. The noise of the panicked crowd melted away. Even the shouts of the officers blurred into silence. It was just her, the rifle, and the man framed in her crosshairs. One shot, her finger tightened. The trigger broke. The bullet tore through the air, slicing time in half. It struck clean, dropping the gunman before he ever fired. His weapon clattered uselessly against the frame. The square fell into silence again, but this time it was different. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of awe. People turned, staring at her, realization dawning. They had seen it. They had seen her line up the impossible shot and save them again, right in front of their eyes. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a hidden officer. It was her. The commanding officer who had moments ago shouted at her now lowered his weapon. His eyes locked on her, stunned. He didn't have to say it. The disbelief was written across his face. Claire lowered the rifle, breathing hard but calm. She had fired 2 shots that day. Both had saved lives. Both had revealed everything. The crowd began to murmur, voices rising with energy, disbelief, admiration, and fear. Who is she? She hit him from that far? She saved us again. She's not normal. The words swirled like smoke, and Claire knew there was no putting them back in the bottle. Her skill was no longer a secret. Her grandfather's shadow training had become her reality, and the world had just witnessed it. Officers moved toward her building, not with weapons raised this time, but with a mix of caution and curiosity. She stayed where she was, the rifle laid carefully at her feet again, her hands raised once more. She didn't resist. She didn't flee. She had made her choice already. When they reached her, the commanding officer stared at her up close. His voice was quieter now, not a bark, but almost reverent. You? He shook his head. You're the one who fired that shot? Claire didn't answer with words. She just looked him in the eye, steady, calm, silent. The silence was answer enough. He exhaled slowly, nodding. That was impossible, he muttered. But you did it. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to speak. Her voice was soft but firm. It wasn't impossible, just necessary. The words seemed to ripple through the crowd as if carried by the air itself. Necessary. That was all it had ever been. As they escorted her down from the rooftop, the crowd parted, watching her with wide eyes. Some reached out as if to touch her, to thank her. Others pulled their children closer, whispering about her uncanny precision. Hero, threat, mystery. She was all of them now. Her grandfather's prophecy had come true. The light had found her. But instead of shrinking from it, she walked forward, step by deliberate step, into the fire of attention and consequence. 2 shots had changed everything, and everyone knew it. The square had emptied of panic, but filled with something new. A simmering energy, a mixture of relief, awe, and dread. Where moments earlier there had been fear of a shooter, now there was a different kind of fear, the fear of the unknown person who had stopped him. Claire. When the officers led her down from the rooftop, the crowd parted in silence. Phones lifted into the air, lenses recording every second, capturing her face, her rifle, her steady walk. It was too late now. Her anonymity had been broken not just for the police, but for the world. She tried to keep her eyes forward, her expression calm. But inside, her thoughts churned like a storm. What happens now? They placed her in the back of a police vehicle, though not roughly, and drove her to the station. Along the way, she could hear the radios buzzing, dispatchers chattering about her shot, about the second gunman, about the civilians saved. Words like miraculous, unbelievable, and sniper bounced back and forth. By the time they reached the station, reporters were already gathering outside. She saw the flashing lights of cameras through the window, journalists shouting over one another for details. Who is she? Was she trained by the military? Is she under arrest? Is she a hero or a vigilante? Questions she couldn't answer, questions she didn't even know how to face. Inside the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly. Claire sat across from two detectives, her hands folded neatly on the table. They didn't cuff her. They didn't threaten her. But their eyes carried the weight of curiosity mixed with unease. "You saved lives today," one of them began. "We're not disputing that. But you need to explain. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Her instinct was to stay silent. Her grandfather's lessons weren't for the world to know, and even if she told the truth, who would believe her? That an old veteran in the woods had trained a quiet girl for years, molding her into something sharper than the military could design? It would sound like fiction. Instead, she said simply, "I practiced. A lot." The detectives exchanged looks. They didn't press, not yet. But Claire could see it in their eyes. The disbelief, the hunger for answers. When they released her hours later, the sun had set. The city outside was a different place than the one she had known that morning. Her name, once a ghost in the quiet, was on every screen, every radio, every mouth. Claire Weston, mystery sniper, saves dozens at town festival. Clips of her walking down from the rooftop replayed endlessly, her face grainy but clear enough. Talk shows debated whether she was a hero or a danger. Some painted her as a guardian angel. Others questioned whether someone like her should even exist. And it didn't stop with the media. By the next day, government vehicles appeared outside her small home. Men in suits, speaking in calm but firm tones, knocked at her door. They didn't threaten her, they offered. "We could use someone like you," one said, handing her a card embossed with the emblem of a federal agency. "Your skill is beyond rare. With the right training, the right resources, you could save countless lives. Not just here, everywhere." Another followed, this one sharper, colder. "Or you could refuse," he said. "But don't think you'll be able to go back to the shadows. Not after this." Claire stood in the doorway, her rifle propped against the wall behind her, silent as stone. They wanted her skill, but they didn't understand it. To them, it was just a weapon. To her, it was something sacred, something her grandfather had passed down with patience and purpose. She wasn't sure she wanted it stolen by bureaucrats and politicians. But refusing came with its own weight. Already she could feel the shift in her neighbors. They watched her differently now. Some with admiration, nodding as she passed. Others with suspicion, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. Children pointed at her, wide-eyed, asking their parents if she was the one who had fired the shot. Her old life, the quiet, invisible one, was gone. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The two men she had shot haunted her thoughts. One had been clear, a ruthless killer raining terror. But the second, the one she dropped in a heartbeat, what was his story? Did he have family? Did he believe he was fighting for something? Her grandfather had always warned her of this. A sniper never kills clean. The bullet takes a life, but it gives you a burden. That burden doesn't leave, not ever. The question is whether you can carry it. Now she carried two. But she also carried the weight of the lives she had saved. The mother clutching her children. the officers who had walked away alive, the boy who had shouted into the crowd, "She saved us." Two weights, two truths, neither lighter than the other. As the days passed, the frenzy grew. News vans parked on her street. Letters poured in, some thanking her, some begging her to join causes, some condemning her for playing God. Her phone buzzed constantly. Offers of interviews, invitations to speak, demands for explanations. She ignored them all. One evening, while the noise outside her home swelled with reporters' voices, Claire sat at her grandfather's old desk. She pulled open the drawer where she kept his notebook, the one filled with diagrams, wind charts, calculations, and scribbled wisdom. She ran her fingers over the faded handwriting, hearing his voice in every line. Skill is a shadow, but shadows only exist because of light. Don't fear it. Shape it. She closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling again. The world wanted to claim her, to define her. Hero, threat, soldier, vigilante, but none of those felt true. What felt true was this. She had made her choice, and now she had to carry it forward. The world had seen her one shot. Now they would never stop watching for the next. And deep down, she knew there would be a next. The days after the shooting blurred into one another, a storm of headlines and speculation. Claire Weston had become a name that no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to the world. News anchors dissected her background, piecing together fragments of her quiet life, trying to build a narrative that made sense. Was she a military dropout? A secret operative? A vigilante hiding in plain sight? They guessed at her past, but none of them guessed the truth, that her story was simpler, quieter, more human. She had not been made by the military or the state. She had been made in silence, in the woods, under the watchful eye of a grandfather who believed skill was not about glory, but about responsibility. That truth remained hers alone. Yet even if no one knew the details, everyone knew the result. The world had seen her shot. The boy's words, "She saved us," had echoed beyond the square, carried through phones, screens, radios. In every conversation, her name became a question. What would she do now? Claire asked herself the same thing each night, staring at her ceiling, her grandfather's notebook open at her side. The burden weighed heavy. 2 men dead by her hand, countless lives spared because of her precision. The weight of both pressed equally on her chest. One night, she dreamed of her grandfather. He stood in the woods, rifle slung across his shoulder, the winter air crisp and sharp. His expression was the same as always, calm, steady, unreadable. "You finally stepped into the light," he said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't want to," she whispered back. "No one ever does," he replied. "But the light doesn't care. The only question is whether you'll let it blind you, or whether you'll use it to see further than anyone else." She woke with tears on her face. The next morning, she packed the rifle into its worn case and carried it into the woods. She walked the same trails she had walked as a child, the same hills where her grandfather had trained her. Birds sang overhead, and the air smelled of pine and earth. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if mocking the chaos of the city. At the clearing where she had once learned to hold her breath and steady her hand, she set the case down. She sat in the grass, closing her eyes, remembering every lesson: patience, silence, control. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice correcting her stance, reminding her that skill was never for vanity, always for necessity. The rifle was no longer just a weapon. It was an inheritance. It was the thread connecting her past to her future. But what would that future be? She had choices. The government still called, their offers growing more persistent by the day. She could accept stepping into their machine, letting them point her where they wished, using her skill as they saw fit. She could be their weapon, or she could disappear again, retreating into the shadows, burying her name and her rifle in anonymity, pretending none of this had ever happened. Both choices felt wrong. One would strip her of her freedom. The other would bury her purpose. So she began to see a third path, not the government's, not the shadows, but her own. If her grandfather had taught her anything, it was that mastery came not from following others, but from shaping her own course. He had refused to let her skill go to waste. Now she would refuse to let it be stolen or silenced. In the weeks that followed, Claire began to travel quietly. She avoided reporters, slipping past the frenzy, moving like the shadow she had always been. But unlike before, she didn't travel to hide. She traveled to learn, to watch, to listen. She visited towns where violence simmered. She listened to stories of people abandoned, ignored, unprotected. She heard whispers of corruption, of power abused, of innocence trapped between predators and authorities too slow to act. And slowly, a purpose began to take shape. She was not a soldier bound to orders. She was not a vigilante hungry for glory. She was something different. A protector who answered only to necessity. The first time she acted again, it was quiet. No cameras, no crowd, no news vans. A man had taken hostages in a gas station on a lonely highway. Police surrounded the building, but couldn't get a clear shot. They prepared for hours, debating tactics, risking lives with every minute wasted. Claire was already there, crouched on a hill with her rifle steady. One breath, one squeeze, and the threat ended before it began. She slipped away before anyone even knew her name. This became her way. She appeared and disappeared, her one shot delivered with precision when no one else could act in time. Rumors spread, stories whispered of a phantom sniper saving lives where no help could reach. Some called her a myth. Others swore she was real. The government searched, desperate to reclaim the woman they had failed to bind. The media speculated endlessly, but the truth remained beyond their reach. Because Claire had become exactly what her grandfather had prepared her to be. Not a shadow hiding from the light. Not a weapon wielded by others. But her own legacy, a force shaped by patience, silence, and necessity. And though the world would never stop searching for her, though the weight of her choices would never leave her shoulders, Claire Weston walked forward without fear. Her story was no longer one of invisibility. It was the story of the shot heard across the world, and of the woman who had turned that shot into her legacy.